Mr. Raine.
Mr. Suter.
The eloquence of which Mr. Suter says his name indicates that we're going to be talking about a not very eloquent aspect of Russian history. That's something known as War Communism, and something else known as the NEP. Stands for New Economic Policy. N, New, Economic, E, Policy, P. Pretty much makes sense, doesn't it? So, why War Communism, and what does that have to do? So, it has everything to do with, in large part, with helping the Bolsheviks win the Civil War. Between 1918 and 1921, of course, Russia is fighting and embroiled in a civil war with the Reds, the Bolsheviks, fighting off attacks from the Whites and the Greens. One of the reasons the White losses, just to recap, is due to their lack of unity and their lack of support. The Reds won in part due to Trotsky's leadership, support of the masses, terror, and geographical factors. Another key factor in the Reds' success was something known as War Communism.
So to understand this, we need to understand what the economy was like before. If you recall back to the decrees, the economy was controlled by peasants and workers who ran their own affairs. You would elect peasant councils and workers' councils who would pick the management to run the factory. This made everyone very happy because they weren't being told what to do. But as you'll see, actually productivity, that's the amount that people make, actually went down. So, for example, the peasants end up keeping their food, and their workers worked less. The people in charge were the people who was voted in, usually the most popular people. They're not going to go about making people work double shifts or tell people off for being a little bit lazy. The peasants' lack of food production came to the real worst in February 1918, when in Petrograd the food ration reached 50 grams per day. This causes food riots and almost topples the sort of Bolshevik government. The Bolsheviks think that something needs to be done to the economy. Leaving it in the hands of the workers and the councils to run it themselves clearly isn't working. The peasants have no incentive, that means push to do, work hard or give food or try anything new. Likewise, the workers have no incentive, no one pushing them, no reason to work harder than they need to, and this is affecting the war. The proposal to deal with this, therefore, is War Communism.
So here's the theory. It's essentially that the Bolshevik government, rather than the peasants' councils, should control and direct all production to help fight the war. This meant that the state, the government under Lenin, would take a more centralized control, and there would be absolutely no role for private business whatsoever. The workers were, because the state has a bigger stick through the use of terror and the Cheka, or through the army, the ability to push the peasants to work harder to quote-unquote save the revolution. And they would do so instead to save the revolution rather than work for, let's say, the reward of money. Harsh discipline and punishments came to those who did not help with establishing the success of War Communism.
I think the very key thing is this is a very big change from before. Before, it was let people run what they want because because this is a socialist idea that everyone work hard, but also politically the Bolsheviks can't afford to bully people around. The pressure of the war means that the Bolsheviks have to take more control, and because people aren't going to like it, have to use harsh means to keep people in line. Now, War Communism gives two major areas of advantage. It gives them increased economic control and also increased political control. So the first major one of these is economic control. This is basically the key aspects of War Communism. War Communism's only aim, and includes in the name, is to get the resources required so that the Bolsheviks could win the war. This meant food, this meant weapons, this meant heavy industry used for turning into tanks and weapons. All of that was needed in quantities, where it was, reliably, where it was needed. So they went about this in a number of ways. Number one, they said that grain could be requisitioned. Now, requisition is a long word. It basically means taking without payment. Soldiers could come to the peasants' village and say, this is needed for the war, and we're going to have it. If the peasants resisted, then force could be used to take it. In order to oversee this, something called the Food Supplies Department was created in 1918. Now, obviously, this was very unpopular, but food is essential for an army. An army which isn't well fed has very low morale. An army with very low morale is not going to stay on the field very long. And if you remember back to last lesson, we talked about the Russian Civil War. It wasn't a battle between two competent armies. Both armies were as useless as each other, and it's basically who could be slightly better than anyone else. If you have reliable food supplies, then your soldiers are happier, they're more likely to fight. Yes, the peasants suffer. Their food is being taken. As we should have seen, there'd be a horrific famine. But the soldiers at this point in time, during the war, matter more than peasants. It's a very brutal logic, but it's a logic that will win them the war. We need to get food in the hands of the soldiers, and we will take it by force. Another aspect will be is that private trade was banned and industry was nationalised. That means industry was taken over by government. They basically didn't want any factories making toys or sofas or stuff that doesn't massively help the war. And the only way you can do that is say you can't own your own company, it's all run by the government. And those old toy factories now, or those own sofa factories, will be turned into making guns and tanks and weapons and uniforms in order to help the war. This obviously upsets everyone who works in these factories and upsets everyone who owns the factories particularly. However, it means that the supply of guns and stuff needed for the war massively increases. The Bolsheviks replaced the workers' committees, which didn't run very well, with managers who were paid more and had authority to discipline. Many of them were even the old factory managers under the Tsar. This is looking surprisingly like the Bolsheviks are going back to the bad old days. They are taking over the old managers, are getting paid more, getting more luxuries, and are able to bully and discipline workers into line. This is not Lenin is not doing this because this is a communist thing to do, but this is what you need to win the war. You need workers to work hard, making your goods on time so you can fight the war with good weapons and equipment.
Okay, so on top of that, labor discipline is enforced. There are fines for lateness and absenteeism. There are passports to stop people from moving around and from leaving the town and the city if they don't like what's happening. So in order to keep entire control of the economy, life gets very, very harsh for anybody working within it. And on top of that, rationing is introduced so that workers and the army are getting the majority, much at the expense of the poor peasants. The benefits of this economic control carry over into the political sphere. Now we see that the Bolsheviks are getting more and more and more involved with the runnings of every aspect of Russian life. And as such, all employees of the state become regulated by state officials who could be, and these employees could be disciplined directly.
And basically someone knows their name. Someone working for the government says, this person works for me, he's not working hard enough. And that's a big ask, that's a big jump.
Because ultimately political control becomes another means for terror. And this, one of the ways that the Bolsheviks are able to enforce their control is through the use of the terror apparatus of the Cheka. Additionally, food and pay would start to come from the state, so they're able to be used to marginalize class enemies. In other words, to take the middle class down a peg, so you have basically the Bolsheviks at the top, everybody else, and a few select managers who are willing to enforce Bolshevik policy with a very long, very hard, and very pointy stick, in which they beat people into submission. So whether or not it was for the needs of the war, the Bolsheviks find it very, very, very convenient to use war communism. It effectively allows them to achieve their socialist dream, but achieve it in a way that gives them the maximum amount of centralized control and power over the nation.
Absolutely. And I think the key phrase here is control. By controlling the economy, everyone is part of the economy. You are controlling people by paying them, by keeping an eye on them, by managing them. And if you're middle class, and we see the end of the middle classes during this era, they get paid so little and so little food that they become undistinguishable from the working classes unless they escape. So the effects of war communism are mixed. The headline: it increases that control of the masses. We now have roving squads who go to towns. And if you don't do much like a teacher, I suppose, if you don't do what they say, there is now punishment. You feel that authority over you. And the hostile peasantry, the peasantry are not used to having anyone tell them what to do. From time immemorial, even the Tsar couldn't control them, really. This massively increased the Bolshevik control over these masses, which is important for the war and then afterwards. As well as this, although as we'll see there are plenty of shortages as a result of all this, this doesn't come at the expense of the army. The army gets their food, the army gets their clothes, the army gets their weapons. Everyone else is has a terrible time, as we shall see, but the army get their stuff. And
not only that, the army wins the war.
Absolutely right.
The costs of winning that war are enormously bad for the Bolsheviks. Are enormously, well, good for the Bolsheviks because they retain control, but bad for the people who are living under the Bolsheviks, I should say. One of the worst effects of war communism, and this can't be underestimated, is that in 1921 alone, famine hits. Famine usually hits a country that is on the brink of starvation. The peasants and the suffering of the peasants left them unable to fight off disease, illness, and starvation.
And I think, sorry, Gerald, I think a key part of this famine is the fact that in 1920, the government said, we're going to take this much food. So they took this much food. The next, in 1920, the harvest was smaller, so they didn't have as much food. So the government still needed to take their X amount of tons of food, let's say 20 tons of food. Where did they get that extra food from? The seeds for next year. Well, that means in 1921, there's fewer seeds, that means fewer stuff being planted, which means there's fewer stuff growing. Then the government then takes they're still there 20 tons as well, and now suddenly people have no food as well. The famine is entirely man-made and Bolshevik-made. By taking the surplus, the seed in 1920 that they would have normally used to grow the stuff next year, there was no food in 1921. The Bolsheviks could have said, it's fine, we'll let you keep some. But they said, no, you gave us 20 last time, you're giving us 20 now. Now, we assume that you're hiding the rest of it. This obviously leads to massive revolts in the countryside. The grain requisitioning, it was a very dangerous job to be. You would have to go in force. We see a massive riot, particularly in the Tambov region in 1920. As well as this, and as a result of this, and peasants start being very creative in hiding their grain, the production between 1913 and 1921 massively dips. Grain goes from 80 million tons to 27.6 million tons. Iron goes from 4.2 to 0.1, and coal from 29 to 9. This is in part because although people are being disciplined, they aren't working. Many of them are fleeing to the countryside just to get their hands on food. And people generally, although they're being told to work, are just escaping and not working hard enough. We see also, as a result of the shortage of food and the sort of brutality of the discipline of working in the cities, a depopulation. Petrograd has 2.2 million people in 1914, but by 1920 it has gone down to 600,000. And deaths per 1,000 population in Petrograd was 21 in 1914, but 90 in 1920. We see a massive shortage of food. We see a massive shortage in skilled labourers. People flee to the countryside to escape the brutal discipline regimes of the Bolsheviks, and the Bolsheviks using terror to keep whoever they can keep in line. As evidenced by the fact in January 1921, food riots unsurprisingly break out. These break out in Moscow and Petrograd. The biggest, of course, were in Moscow. Food rations were cut by a third in the winter as sort of food became scarce. The crowds begin forming. The Bolsheviks call in the Red Army. The Red Army can't fire at the crowd. They feel too bad, but the Cheka comes in and starts shooting the crowd and really guns them down. The Bolsheviks are willing to stop at no end to continue the effects of war communism, to win the war, and to exercise their control. And of course, massive political opposition arises from the peasants, the workers, from left-wingers. Martial law is declared in the major cities of Moscow and Petrograd. Things start to spiral out of control. And the real symbolic example that we can see of where things get really out of control happens at the Russian naval base in Kronstadt. You'll recall maybe when we talked about the October Revolution that in Petrograd, the Navy base at Kronstadt, these guys were early supporters of the Bolsheviks. These people came over to the Bolshevik side, and they actually helped in letting the Bolsheviks gain power. These people had had enough. The early supporters of the October Revolution, the early supporters of the Bolsheviks, give up on them. They weren't particularly left-wing. They weren't massively Bolshevik, but they wanted a change, and they certainly didn't want to fight for the Tsar anymore during the First World War. They protest, they rise up, and they basically start calling for the removal of the Bolsheviks and a more socialist state to replace what was happening under Lenin. The Bolsheviks will retaliate with unbelievable brutality. They'll go to the naval base at Kronstadt where the initial supporters of the Bolsheviks are, and the Red Guard and the Cheka will kill 20,000 Russian sailors.
Kill or wound, I should say, 20,000 Russian sailors. Many of the leaders, in fact, all of the leaders who were caught were executed, and many of the followers were sent to a gulag, which is a work camp with unimaginably harsh conditions, no pay, and you were basically worked until you died. And that's what happened to many of the sailors in the Kronstadt Mutiny. Now, why do we tell you this story? It's a huge deal. These are the heroes of the 1917 revolutions. These are people who were reliably left-wing, initial supporters of the Bolsheviks, and they hate war communism, and they're willing to turn against the Bolsheviks in this regard. This shows, more than anything, to the leadership, particularly Lenin, if these guys are going to turn their back on you, something has to change.
I think that's a key thing. If we look at the last slide as well, soldiers are refusing to fire on crowds, and now the sailors who were reliably on your side are going against the Bolsheviks. This shows there's vast amounts of hatred as a result of war communism. It may be brilliant for the war, and it may have made sure that the Bolsheviks get the weapons and the supplies they need to win the war, but they cannot keep it up so longer. Lenin described the Kronstadt Mutiny as a lightning bolt that lit up reality. And what he meant by that, it was a sudden surprise which made him realize things had to change. And very quickly afterwards, after crushing the sailors, because you can't let anyone get away with being revolutionary, they change their course to try and make people happy, and they bring in the NEP, which, as Mr. Raine artfully said at the start of the lesson, stands for the New Economic Program.
Or policy.
Or policy. It's new, it's focused on the economy, and it's policy program/policy. Now, Lenin is able to do this to some extent, because the war was pretty much won. By 1921, as you should remember from last lesson, pretty much, the war's not entirely over, but the major threats are done. They can afford to reduce war communism now because they don't need as many soldiers, they don't need as much resources, they don't need as many weapons to keep things going. Without some change, Lenin correctly realizes that the Bolsheviks are likely to be overthrown. If the military are not on your side very quickly, as what happened in February and also in October, could happen to the Bolsheviks as well. You need people on your side. So Lenin, explaining to the Central Committee that we are making economic concessions, that's giving in something economically, so we don't have to make political concessions. What he's essentially saying is we'll give them something economic so they don't want to change the government. By giving economic freedom, people will be less angry, and therefore the Bolsheviks would be under less of a threat. So the NEP was an attempt, and a very successful one, to try and address the wrongs of war communism, to make people slightly less angry at the government and feel more like the government was on its side.
Okay, the NEP in practice. The first major point to make is that the fact that Lenin abolishes this notion of grain rationing. What he does is he replaces it with what's known as a tax in kind. In other words, a certain amount of what you produce has to go to the state. After that tax to the state is paid, you're allowed to keep, distribute, or do whatever you want with what's left over. And as such, small businesses reopen. A whole new class of small businessmen come into play. These people are allowed to make profits. They're giving people jobs, and they're making more consumer goods and encouraging peasants to have a reason to sell food. These people are known as
kulaks.
The kulaks, small business, spelled K-U-L-A-C-K?
A-K.
A-K. Thank you. Kulaks. These are this sort of group of small businessmen, small traders that sort of flourish under the new economic policy. These are the real, it's ultimately the goal of communism is to abolish class. This allows an abolishment of class, with a small exception, to allow people to, continue keeping the Bolsheviks in power. It allows the notion of private trade as well. Shops are allowed to trade money. Money comes back into the economy under war communism. The currency of Russia was how much did you produce? You get X amount of grain, X amount of milk, X amount of bread because you produce this much, or this is your ration for the day. There was no need for money, and then money comes back into play as a way of, I guess, asserting value in an economy. And lastly, the state will keep control over large factories, particularly those in heavy industry. There's a reintroduction of managers, including foreign quote-unquote advisors, to help modernize the Russian economy. And the state will not give back to the owners of their factories, and the state will retain large degrees of control over heavy industry, the stuff sort of essential for moving Russia forward.
I think the key thing for going through this is that they are bringing back at least a little bit capitalism. They realise that for people to want to work hard, to people to want to produce goods, to produce grain, you can't run it like War Communism and bully them into it. You can't do what was done before because people are lazy and just keep it. You need to allow a little bit of capitalism so people feel like, I want that thing over there. If I work hard, I will get this. Again, it's very clear all the way down. Grain requisitions abolished so that peasants can sell grain. They are more likely to work harder for that grain so they can buy more stuff. Small businesses reopen so that people are going to have jobs, people are going to make stuff for profit, so they're going to make more things. And again, yes, there's managers. These managers are paid more, and foreign advisors are paid a lot more. What is this? This is a very, very dubious shift back, in a smaller way, to capitalism. It is a pragmatic decision by Lenin. By pragmatic, we mean it is a realistic. He's, in theory, if he's a pure Marxist, he shouldn't do any of this, but he realizes to keep power, he's going to have to. And the effects of this follow like so, and actually we see a massive improvement in the economy. By 1922, the food and goods crisis are all pretty much gone. 1923, cereal, that's not just cereal for like your breakfast, that's grains, production improves by 23%. Factory output increases by 200% between 1920 and 1923. Coal rises from 8.9 million tons in 1921 to 16.1 million tons in 1924. We see the rise in NEP men, which is another name for kulaks, people who make a relatively large amount of money from the NEP. And this all seems very communist, but it needs to happen to keep the people happy. We also see some negatives as well as this. In order to get stuff done now, we see the rise of bribery. If you want to buy or run a business, all you have to do is bribe the right communist official and you'll get put in influence. As well as this, because it's capitalist, it upsets some hardcore communists who feel like we're going back to the bad old days. What's the point of doing that? We might as well go all the way back, because then they fight against the capitalism. Isn't capitalist unfair? And already we are seeing a class difference between net men and workers. Yes, it might be small for now, but the communists argued once people have got a little bit of extra money, they'll keep that going, and that good difference will grow and grow and grow and grow until you go back to the bad old days. So the NEP improves the economy because now people have a greater reason to work. They work harder in factories, they work harder making wheat and goods, and they work harder in the coal mines and the iron mines, etc., etc. The side of part of this, we see the rise of inequality, not massively, but some.
So in summary, war communism is effectively essential. It gives one of the key reasons why the Red Army is able to win the Civil War. It allows them to provide resources for the war, in terms of food primarily, reliably, in other words, to the front, so the soldiers could always have enough to eat in order to continue to win this war. However, the continuation long-term of war communism and the massive restrictions on food and calorie intake for most Russians meant that there was a huge decline in quality of life and health, and this of course leads to massive anger against the Bolsheviks. Most notably, the uprising in Kronstadt is your best example of sort of a backlash against war communism, and this really leads Lenin to look at the situation and make a change. And what he introduces is known as a new economic program or policy, and this is introduced to calm people down. It addresses some of the fundamental problems, ends rationing.
Harsh discipline.
Instills some aspects of a capitalist economy, the reintroduction of money, but also causes some dissatisfaction. In other words, it offends a lot of the hardcore communists and so on and so forth. But largely speaking, the NEP works, and Russia is able to sort of transition from the war into a more stable society.
Thank you very much.
That's all we have to say for today. Look